My old high school has a very annoying problem. It wasn't bullies or mean teachers like in typical schools. My high school has a faulty fire alarm. I say has because it's still going on. Every day at precisely 10:35 in the morning, the fire alarm would activate. The alarm would sound for 6 minutes straight before stopping abruptly. It happened so often that the staff eventually learned to ignore it. I know what you're thinking. Why doesn't the school fix the alarm? The thing is, the staff had tried many times, but for some reason, nobody could fix it. Before I started my first year of high school, my older brother Jeremy told me about the fire alarm. Our parents enrolled us in that school because it's one of the best in our city. This is the sole reason why the school never closed. Like everyone in this school, I learned to ignore the busted alarm, but that soon changed during my senior year. There was an abandoned classroom on the third floor. It used to be a place that held shop classes until a fire broke out. At the time, I didn't know if anyone was hurt during that incident. One of my classes that year was in a classroom right next to the abandoned one. This class took place during the alarm glitch. One day, while the alarm sounded, I left class to go to the nurse's office. I had a headache and was in desperate need of aspirin. I'd passed the abandoned classroom when I smelled something. It was smoke coming from that very classroom. The door had been locked since the fire. I figured that another student must have broken in to smoke. I'm not one to snitch, so I left it alone. Later that day, I was having lunch with my friends when one of them mentioned the smoke coming from the abandoned classroom. Mason, another friend, claimed that it was the ghost of Mr. Ortiz. Mr. Ortiz was the school's shop teacher. He was in the classroom when the fire broke out. Unfortunately, when the first responders arrived, Mr. Ortiz was already dead. The fire started at 10:35 a.m. Mr. Ortiz was trapped in the classroom for 6 minutes until he died of smoke inhalation. There are rumors that Mr. Ortiz's ghost was messing with the fire alarm. Some students claim to have smelled smoke coming from the abandoned classroom while the alarm sounded. I tensed when I heard that. Before we parted ways, Mason proposed that we break into the classroom to look for the ghost. I went along with it to prove to myself that there was no ghost. None of us had the same class for that hour, so we could ask for hall passes without raising suspicion. The four of us agreed to meet at the abandoned classroom at 10:34 a.m. We carried on with our plan the following day. Lisa, a girl in our friend group, picked the classroom's lock. We went inside and waited for the fire alarm to activate. When it did, my friends and I were met with the odor of smoke. A raspy gasp then startled us. We all instinctively turned around, wondering what made that noise. I felt my heart sink to my feet as I saw what it was. A heavy-set man with red, charred skin was shambling around in the classroom. He repeatedly heaved as he made his way towards us. Smoke came out of his mouth every time it opened. His soulless eyes were barely visible behind the cracked lens of his glasses. Mason grabbed my arm before I could process what I was witnessing, and we ran out of the classroom. I don't remember what happened after that, as I was still in shock. I can tell you that my friends and I got detention for cutting class. That evening, my parents sat me down. I was sure that I was going to get lectured and even grounded, but instead, my dad tearfully told me a story. He was a freshman in my school when he took Mr. Ortiz's class. Mr. Ortiz was a strict teacher who yelled at his students over the slightest mistake. No matter how hard his students tried, they couldn't get more than a C+ from Mr. Ortiz. And with each criticism from his teacher, my dad got gradually sicker of him. One day, Dad and his friends decided to play a prank on Mr. Ortiz. His classroom was full of wood. Some of it was just lying around in the classroom. There was a period in the school day when Mr. Ortiz didn't have a class to teach. He used this spare time to nap at his desk. Dad had this idea to light one of the wooden planks with a lighter. Mr. Ortiz kept a fire extinguisher near him, so my dad wasn't too worried about the consequences. Dad and his friends snuck into Mr. Ortiz's classroom and spotted a plank propped up near the door. Dad lit the plank with his lighter before they all ran off. Apparently, the smell of smoke woke up Mr. Ortiz. He grabbed his fire extinguisher and ran to the fire. However, Mr. Ortiz tripped and landed on the concrete floor. He was knocked out, and the fire began to spread. You already know what happened next. The school didn't have CCTV cameras back then, and everyone else was in class. Dad and his friends kept silent out of fear. When the school reopened, the fire alarm suddenly went off. The school staff tried to turn it off, but to no avail. When it stopped, everyone blamed it on technical difficulties. But then the fire alarm turned itself on again the following school day. It wasn't until the third time around that Dad realized something horrifying. The alarm sounded at 10:35 a.m., the exact time Dad and his friends pulled that deadly prank. Even after this revelation, he still refused to come clean. I didn't get punished afterward. My friends and I decided not to tell anyone what we saw that day. No one would have believed us anyway. It's been years since all this happened, but every time I hear a fire alarm, I think of Mr. Ortiz and his tragic end. I loved Osmosis Jones as a kid. It taught me the importance of health and how to take better care of myself. The movie also inspired me to become a doctor. After graduation, I got into one of the best medical schools in the state. I knew I was going to face all kinds of sicknesses, but then I encountered something in my first year. Even Harvard Medical School couldn't have prepared me for what transpired. I was 2 months into my first year when Dr. Nash got a patient with a peculiar case. Dr. Nash was the best doctor in our hospital. I was shadowing him the day said patient was brought in. I can't disclose his name for legal reasons, so I'll call him Nicholas. When we met Nicholas, he didn't seem too bad. He was suffering from a common cold from what we could tell. Yet for some reason, Nicholas demanded to be admitted. Nicholas claimed that he was going to die. When asked to elaborate, he rambled about being infected by some ancient evil. He was so hysterical that we had to drug him. I was injecting the drug when I noticed how sweaty Nicholas was. I then looked at his vitals and saw that his temperature was rising. Before we could determine what to do next, Nicholas started having breathing problems. We lost him in less than a couple of minutes. Dr. Nash and I were floored by what had just happened. How could someone just pass out of the blue like that? I didn't know why at the time, but what happened to Nicholas struck me as strangely familiar. I knew I'd seen this before, but I couldn't recall where. When my shift ended, I checked my email. There was one sent by an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "A warning to all hospitals." I became a little worried when I saw that. I expected it to be some urgent message from the government or something, but when I opened the email, there was just a single video with a blank thumbnail. It dawned on me that whoever sent this couldn't have been from the government. Out of curiosity, I decided to watch the video. The video began with an older man sitting in front of the camera. He looked to be in his 60s, and was dressed like an archaeologist. The man had a devastated look on his face. He introduced himself as Dr. Lyle Ember, an archaeologist from my hometown. He said that by the time he recorded this, it had been 6 weeks since his excavation in the Enfermedad Forest. Enfermedad Forest was located about 100 miles south of my hometown. I live in Louisiana and was very close to the Mexican border. Anyway, there was an ancient temple that stood in those woods. When Dr. Ember learned of it, he gathered a team and went to the temple. Dr. Ember was shocked to see that the temple was filled with gold. Nicholas, who was a member of his team, immediately rushed to the treasure. Dr. Ember scolded Nicholas as he collected some coins. It wasn't until after the threats of being fired that Nicholas discarded the gold. After some translations, Dr. Ember discovered that the temple was dedicated to an unknown entity called Thraxelkhan. Thraxelkhan was an Aztec spirit who cursed its victims with a disease that the locals called the Hidden Fire. It got its name from its ability to increase the body's temperature and kill its victims before it could be diagnosed. Dr. Ember learned the legends surrounding this temple through some locals. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico, one Aztec priest took a drastic step to protect his people. He knew that the Spanish were searching for gold, so he made a trap for the invaders. The Aztecs gathered many riches and stored them in the temple. The priest then asked Thraxelkhan to curse anyone who removed the treasure from his temple. As the priest predicted, the conquistadors took the bait. After retrieving the treasure, the conquistadors suddenly fell ill. It started with a cold, but one by one, the conquistadors began dying off. They described the illness as a burning inferno within their bodies. It took at least 2 days for the disease to kill a victim. At some point, the conquistadors realized that the outbreak occurred after stealing the temple's treasures. After returning the riches, the conquistadors miraculously recovered. For 500 years, that temple stood in isolation, forgotten by most of the outside world. And with it being the only one dedicated to Thraxelkhan, the deity and his disease were forgotten as well. Somehow, the creator of Osmosis Jones learned of Thraxelkhan. This, in turn, inspired the villain for his movie, Thrax. At the end of the video, Dr. Ember implored everyone to stay away from Thraxelkhan's temple. I sat there trying to process what I just watched. I then felt my heart sink when I realized something horrifying. What happened to Nicholas that day was precisely what happened to Frank in Osmosis Jones. That's where I recognized his illness from. For years, I thought the Red Death was a fictional disease. Yet there I was, seeing the disease with my own eyes. I guess Nicholas decided to return for the treasure, despite knowing the consequences. Wherever his stash is, I hope it's been returned to its rightful place. Otherwise, the world would be in great danger. My brother Luke and I went to Ireland last year to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. He thought it would be cool to celebrate the holiday in the country it originated from. He wasn't wrong. I can't explain why, but something about the situation boosted my holiday spirit. Luke and I were exploring the outskirts of Dublin when we stumbled upon a beggar. He was an old, frail man dressed in dusty rags. His weak figure sat upon a tree stump. Feeling sorry for the guy, I decided to give him $20. I then looked at Luke, expecting him to provide the man with something. He dug into his pockets, only to shrug. "Are you kidding me?" I demanded. "You forgot your wallet again?" "Sorry, bro," Luke replied. "You know me." I then looked back at the homeless man and saw a hint of anger in his eyes. I dragged Luke away to get us out of that awkward situation. When we got back to our hotel room, I told Luke off for his carelessness. I then told him to give the old man some money before we returned home. Luke scoffed, saying that I'd already donated, so it's not necessary. It was getting late, and my brother and I went to bed. I was fast asleep when something woke me up. I thought it was Luke snoring. I turned my head in his direction and saw a silhouette standing between our beds. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I recognized the figure. It was the beggar from before. I was about to get up and ask him what he was doing there when he turned to me. I froze in fear when I saw the homeless man's face. His skin was decomposed and white lights replaced his eyes. He smiled at me before disappearing into nothingness. I lay there, wondering what I just witnessed. I soon brushed it off as a nightmare and tried to get back to sleep. Luke and I returned to America, and I never thought of the poor man again. A few days later, my life took an unexpected turn. I'd received a promotion and a raise about a week later. Everything was going great for me. Luke, however, wasn't so lucky. He lost his job and was evicted from his apartment. I didn't know about it until Luke visited my house one day. Naturally, I assumed it was the result of his lack of discipline, but then Luke told me something unsettling. According to Luke, he's had a recurring dream since we left Ireland. It was about that beggar on the tree stump. This was also when things started to go wrong for him. When Luke described the man as zombie-like in appearance, dread poured in. Luke began to have these dreams around the same time I got that promotion. Could this be a coincidence? I told Luke that I saw the beggar in our hotel room. The only thing we could think of doing was Googling Irish zombie. At the time, I felt silly doing so, but then I found something that made sense of everything. There's a creature in Irish folklore called Fá Gorta. It's a corpse-like spirit that can grant good or bad luck. If you donate money to one, you'll be blessed with good fortune, but if you don't, you'll have the exact opposite. Luke looked at me with wide eyes. I knew what he was thinking. Before all this happened, neither of us believed in the supernatural, but after everything that's happened, this couldn't have been a coincidence. Luke and I are currently looking for ways to lift the curse on him. For now, he's staying in my place until we sort this out. At least my brother has finally learned to be more disciplined. Life after high school was challenging for me. I couldn't go to college due to financial problems in my family. I knew that if I wanted to go to college, I'd have to earn enough money for tuition. It was hard, but I managed to land a job at the Ivory Hotel. It had just been built, and the manager was desperate for employees. Granted, I'd be paid minimum wage, but it's still something. All I had to do was get as many hours as possible. Anyway, I was on room service duty on my first day of work. Everything was going well until I brought room service to a guy on the 3rd floor. I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I knocked again, still nothing. I didn't know what to do at this point, so I went to get my manager. I was making my way to the elevator when I heard a loud scream. It was coming from a nearby room with the door open. I ran to the hotel room and saw Ruth running towards me. Ruth was one of the maids. In tears, she told me to call 911. She'd just entered the hotel room to clean when she saw that the guest was in bed. For context, this was around noon, and the Ivory Rose Hotel's guests were mainly tourists. Usually, they'd be out of their rooms by then to explore our city. So why was this guy in bed? At first, Ruth thought that the guest overslept. She gently nudged him, asking him to get up. Ruth panicked when she realized that the guest's body was cold. I called 911, trying not to panic. I tried to comfort Ruth while we waited for the paramedics. After giving our statements to the police, our manager, Mrs. Benson, demanded to know what happened. She's put a lot of money into her hotel, and this incident could ruin everything. Ruth and I swore that we didn't know what happened. Mrs. Benson warned us that if any of the employees were responsible for the death, she'd fire them on the spot. Ruth was genuinely scared of getting fired. You see, she immigrated here from Ireland with a work visa. If Ruth lost her job, she'd be deported. When the police investigated the hotel, they discovered that the guest I delivered room service to died as well. What they discovered next shocked everyone. Both guests died of asphyxiation by illuminating gas. Nobody knew where the illuminating gas could have come from. The police searched the entire hotel room for gas containers. However, there were no traces of it anywhere. At this point, the employees were brought in for questioning. Of course they'd assume that the killer is a hotel staff member. If you asked me, I'd say it was Greg. Greg was this guy who strongly opposed the construction of the Ivory Rose Hotel. He rambled on about how the empty lot the hotel was built on should stay empty. No one knew why Greg was so worked up over some lot. One of my coworkers made some joke referring to the Poltergeist movie. I should probably mention that I'm not too familiar with my town's history. I have no idea what stood in that lot before the hotel. Yet somehow, I'm sure that it was never a cemetery. Out of curiosity, I asked Mrs. Benson about the history of our hotel's location. She said she didn't know anything. The person who sold her the lot didn't mention any history. For all we knew, the lot had always been empty before the hotel. That answer satisfied me, and I never thought of Greg's ramblings again. 3 days passed, and the police couldn't find any leads. That's when the Ivory Rose Hotel was faced with another tragedy. Another guest was found dead in his room. What's even worse was that he died the same way as the last two. Once again, nobody could figure out how it happened. From that day on, a guest died daily. For some reason, the Ivory Rose Hotel was never forced to close. Mrs. Benson had security cameras installed in hopes of finding the killer. To everyone's horror, the cameras didn't catch anything. The death seemed to occur in the middle of the night. However, the footage didn't show anyone going in or out of the victims' rooms. It didn't take long for the Ivory Rose Hotel to be labeled as haunted. Imagine my surprise when people continued to go to the hotel. I guess the concept of staying someplace where you could die is exciting. Either that, or some of the patrons didn't believe in ghosts. If it were up to me, I'd have the hotel closed. I was walking home from work one day when a familiar voice called out to me. I groaned as I recognized it as Greg's. I asked him what he wanted. As always, Greg spewed some nonsense about the lot. Between Greg's ramblings and the string of mysterious deaths, I've had enough. I blew up at Greg, asking him what the hell his problem was. Greg said something along the lines of, "Your hotel has brought him back." I asked Greg what he was talking about. It turned out that there was another hotel before the Ivory Rose Hotel. It was founded by a man named H.H. Holmes. He was a madman who killed anyone who stayed in his hotel. Each room had pipes that released illuminating gas, thus suffocating his victims. When the authorities captured Holmes, his hotel was shut down, then demolished. The hotel was exactly where the Ivory Rose Hotel stands now. Apparently, the lot was cursed by Holmes' evil. His spirit invaded the Ivory Rose Hotel, killing the guests the way he used to. At first, I didn't believe Greg, but the more I thought about it, there was really no other explanation. I needed my job, but people are dying because of that damn hotel. Mrs. Benson wouldn't close the Ivory Rose Hotel even if her life depended on it. What should I do? I live in one of Iceland's biggest cities. Like some of my friends, I craved the clean, quiet nature of a rural atmosphere. I don't remember who, but someone suggested that I camp out near Avallis Fjord. It's this beautiful place near the north side of the country. I've done some research and it seemed like a great idea, so I went on my solo camping trip the following weekend. But as soon as I arrived, red flags began to show. I was looking for a spot to set up camp when I overheard two young men arguing. I would have passed by them had I not heard what they said about the fjords. "I'm not doing it, Adam," one of the men yelled. "Don't be such a wuss, Jake," Adam scoffed. "Remember, we came all the way from America to record the first sighting of the Avallis ghost. No way am I going to miss out on this opportunity because you decided to chicken out." Apparently, Avallis Fjords was believed to be haunted by a female ghost. If you go there at sunset, you'll hear what sounds like a woman singing. Nobody ever saw this ghost, but they did hear her. As is usually the case, not everyone believed in this legend. The main reason behind the skepticism was that nobody ever saw this spirit. Some have even used the classic, "It's just the wind" line. I heard of this singing ghost when I was a kid through my cousin. She and her father lived in a village near Avallis Fjords. The parents of that village tell their kids about the Avallis ghost, except they describe her as some boogeyman. Or should I say boogie woman? Anyway, I figured that this singing ghost was something the village made up to scare the kids straight. I decided to check out Avallis Fjords myself, not because I believed in ghosts, but because I wanted to hear the strange sounds for myself. I'd set up camp as close to Avallis Fjords as possible. I was taking in the beautiful scene before me when I realized that the sun was going down. Night came and I could hear something from the fjords. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the cliffs. As I got closer, I couldn't believe my ears. It was the unmistakable sound of a woman singing. She was singing in Icelandic. For context, I moved to Iceland from England about 5 years prior. I didn't learn Icelandic because most of the people I've met here spoke English. I was walking alongside the stream when the singing got louder. However, it wasn't because I was getting closer to the source. The woman singing was actually coming from behind me. I felt the air getting colder as the voice got closer. A chill ran down my spine as I felt the woman's breath on the back of my neck. I stopped walking. Half of me screamed to keep going, but I was also curious to know what the Avallis ghost looked like. To be honest, I didn't think I'd see anything. I was dead wrong. I turned around and saw something horrifying. A woman's disembodied head was floating before me. Her hair was a ratty mess of braids. The head didn't stop singing even after I stopped to look at it. The singing then transformed into yelling. The sudden change in tone snapped me out of it and I ran away. I didn't feel safe going back to my camp, so I ran to my cousin's village. I must have looked like a madman when I entered my cousin's village. I was banging on her door until she opened it. I was a rambling mess when I tried to explain what had happened. Meanwhile, my cousin's husband looked at me as if I were nuts. Somehow, my cousin made sense of my gibberish and let me into her home. It turned out that there was more to the story than she told me all those years ago. We just weren't old enough to hear the rest yet. The Avallis ghost was a resident of my cousin's village back in the 12th century. She was famous for her incredible singing. Apparently, the popularity got to her head because she became incredibly entitled. The worst was when she decided to openly cheat on her husband. One day, the husband snapped and decided to take revenge on his wife. He knew that some of the men she slept with were married themselves, so he recruited the scornful wives to help with his plan. In the middle of the night, the husband and his allies kidnapped the wife. They dragged her to Avallis Fjords, where she was decapitated. Her head was thrown into the water, while the body was left for the predators. Since then, Avallis Fjords has been haunted by the song of the murdered villager. I don't know why the Avallis ghost allowed me to see her. Maybe it's because nobody stuck around long enough to find out. At least that's what my cousin suggested. Later, I found out what happened to Jake and Adam. They thought the Avallis ghost would be on the cliffs for some reason. That's why I never saw them. They searched for a couple of hours before giving up and leaving the fjords. I guess the Avallis ghost never approached them because she was bound to the river where she was killed. Either that, or scaring the crap out of me was enough for her. If you ask me, Adam and Jake were the lucky ones. Grand Isle is an island 20 miles west of Alaska. It was used as a shipping port for the Soviet Union, but in 1956, Grand Isle was suddenly abandoned. The island was uninhabited before all the workers were in Russia, so when the port closed, they returned to their homeland. For some reason, no one came forward with an explanation. Grand Isle had been deserted since. 50 years later, the NOAA received strange news. One night, a fishing boat was passing Grand Isle. The crew saw a huge boat in the water. At first, they thought it was plankton, but then the crew realized that the color was all wrong. They also noted that the light appeared to be moving in circles. At the time, the NOAA didn't think much of it, but after numerous sightings at the exact location, they decided to investigate. The NOAA's radar didn't pick up any signals from that area. This meant that whatever made that light couldn't have been the sun. Marine biologists suggested that it's an undiscovered species of fish. However, the NOAA wanted to look into it first. My crew and I were sent to Grand Isle to look into it. Since the light only appeared at nighttime, we had to camp out there until then. Being the submarine pilot of my crew, it was up to me to find the source. I can't explain why, but something about staying at the end of the port was so good. A weathered Soviet Union flag was dancing in the wind on the flagpole that stood in the middle of Grand Isle. I was surprised to find the flag still flying after the port's abandonment. But that wasn't the only strange thing I noticed. My crew and I found several boxes which were never shipped to their intended destinations. In fact, the whole island looked as if everyone had left in a hurry. The craziest thing was that Grand Isle was missing something very crucial to the port: a lighthouse. A lighthouse provides a source of light for incoming ships. Without one, they'd crash into the island. My crew agreed that it was weird that Grand Isle didn't have a lighthouse. One of my crew members suggested that it was destroyed during the Cold War. However, I didn't see any damaged structure that could have been a lighthouse. The whole day, my crew and I shared theories on how the port could have managed without a lighthouse. When night came, my team and I gathered at the spot where the light should be visible. I have to admit, the underwater light was amazing to look at. Anyway, I got into my submarine and dove down into the water. I was halfway to the ocean floor when I found the source of the mysterious light. My jaw dropped as I discovered what it was. It was a lighthouse. Yes, a functioning lighthouse was standing on the ocean floor. As I examined the building, I spotted something in the beacon. I saw a man standing near the beacon's light. He was slouching with his head down. When my sub was right in front of him, I was able to get a good look at him. He was dressed in a torn docker uniform. He then lifted his head and I could see his face. It was pale, with parts of skin missing. One of his eyes was missing, and the remaining one was a glowing green light. This man, if you'd even call him that, opened his mouth until it was twice as wide as the possible. I knocked the hell out of there and went back to the surface. My crew saw how freaked out I was and asked what had happened. I told them about the lighthouse and the freak in the beacon. I was expecting my crew to call me crazy. Well, most of them did, but the one crew member who showed concern was Kelly. Kelly's dad was in the U.S. military during the Cold War. According to Kelly, his dad was working undercover at Grand Isle the year it was closed. That's when he met a guy named Vadim. Vadim was a disturbed Russian who hated his country. Kelly's dad often heard the ramble about how he would send the USSR to hell and all that. Nobody seemed to notice that or his behavior. Maybe if they did, things could have ended differently. One night, tragedy struck at Grand Isle. Its lighthouse, the piece of land it stood on, suddenly sank into the ocean. The same lighthouse Ivory. Vadim was reported missing the day the incident occurred. I think that thing I saw in the lighthouse's beacon was him. I don't know how Vadim managed to see the entire lighthouse like that. If I didn't know better, I'd say that the cause was supernatural. Now I understand why the Soviet Union abandoned Grand Island. My crew and I mentioned the sunken lighthouse to our superiors. As for the mysterious light, we said that we couldn't find anything. I mean, what scientist would believe us? Maybe some marine biologist will explore that part of the ocean for that undiscovered species. I don't know how the world would react if they knew what was on. Only time will tell. I'm a captain involved with the Mississippi River cruises. My career began a few years back, just in time for summer. At the time, the cruise line I worked in decided to try night cruises. I was chosen to handle our first one. Seeing as it was a night cruise, I expected the passengers to be couples looking for a romantic evening. Either that, or the passengers could be looking for ghosts floating about. This is Louisiana, after all. I was born and raised in New Orleans, and I never saw these so-called spirits. Regardless, I'm not one to judge others for their beliefs. Anyway, due to late notice, nobody ordered any tickets. I didn't mind. I was just grateful that I got to do my first cruise. I was in the pilot cabin driving the steamboat when I thought I heard something. As I listened closely, I realized that someone was walking outside the cabin. I was both scared and confused. I knew that nobody was supposed to be on the cruise that night. I didn't even see anyone board the steamboat. I was thinking of how this person could have boarded the boat when I heard cries of pain. The pilot cabin's door had a small window that allowed me to see the deck. I peeked through the window, trying not to be noticed by the intruder. All I saw was a man shambling away from me. He moved as if he were severely injured. The riverboats of my cruise line were provided with first aid kits in the pilot cabins. I grabbed it before carefully approaching the intruder. As I got closer, I got a better look at the man. He wore a dark blue uniform and cap, which were soaking wet. I called out to the stranger, asking him if he needed help. I stopped dead in my tracks when he turned to face me. The man's face was decayed and one of his cheeks was missing, revealing his rotten teeth. I then noticed his outfit and recognized it immediately. It was a Union soldier's uniform. The man continued to wail as if he were in excruciating pain. I bolted back into the pilot cabin and locked the door behind me. I picked up the radio and called for help. I don't remember much of what happened after that. My next memory was during a private conversation with my employer. We were in his office when he finally decided to tell me the truth. It turned out that the real reason why my cruise had no passengers was that it was a test run. A particular part of the Mississippi River was rumored to be haunted. In 1865, a steamboat called Sultana exploded, killing most of its passengers. Some of them were Union soldiers. When I heard this story, I understood everything. What I thought was a stowaway was actually the restless soul of one of the Union soldiers. After that, my employer decided to never do night cruises again. He even gave me a raise in compensation for my experience. I still work at that cruise line. After all, I can't let one bad experience with a dead man ruin my career. My employer still sticks to day cruises to this day. I didn't have any more encounters after that night, and hopefully never will again. I'm a paranoid person. I suppose it's my fault, seeing as I started listening to crime podcasts a couple of years back. I can't even count the number of times I'd heard a story where something terrible happened to the protagonist because of some mistake they made. I don't know if it was luck or something else, but most of the stories I'd stumbled upon had this one thing in common. They each took a dark turn when the criminal entered the house through the main door. Sometimes, it's because the victim couldn't see whoever was standing at their door. This is what prompted me to install a doorbell camera. It's not that I live in a bad neighborhood, I just couldn't feel safe without one. About 3 days after the camera's installment, I found something on my doorstep. It was two black feathers tied together at the stems with a white string. I was baffled. Was this supposed to be a prank? I checked the camera's footage and saw something even more baffling. At 2 a.m., someone ran to my front door. They then bent down and ran off in the direction they came from. The person was wearing a hoodie and face mask, so I couldn't identify them. I decided to let it go, as they didn't do anything horrible. By the following day, I'd already forgotten about the incident. But then I found another pair of black feathers bound by a white string. I checked the footage, and sure enough, it was the same person. This time, I spotted something that could help me identify the stranger. When they turned to run away, I saw a familiar logo on the back of the hoodie. It was for a high school lacrosse team. This high school was very close to my neighborhood. I had this one neighbor who had recently graduated from that school. His name was Daryl. We weren't friends, but I'd seen him wear that hoodie several times before. I wanted to ask Daryl why he left those feathers on my doorstep. I wasn't mad, I just wanted to know why he did it. However, that had to wait. By then, Daryl's family had already left for vacation, and I didn't have their contact information, so all I could do was wait until they returned. I proceeded with my day as usual until nightfall. I was watching TV in my living room when I smelled something awful. For context, my kitchen was next to the living room. The two areas shared one big room. I figured that it was time to take out the trash, so I did. But when I re-entered my house, the smell was still there. I checked my fridge, thinking that something went bad. Unfortunately, I didn't find anything there either. I was looking around for the source when I got a notification on my phone. My doorbell camera detected movement. I opened the app and gasped when I saw what was outside. A hideous figure stood at my door. It looked like a hairless primate with tusks and horns. It was making a sound that was like a combination of heavy breathing and growling. I stood there, trying to process what I was looking at. Suddenly, the creature went silent and slowly turned its head to face the camera. The monster spoke in a language that I couldn't identify. When it finished, it paused for a moment before getting angry. The creature then started banging on the door, screaming something in its language. I ran into the bathroom and locked the door before calling the police. For obvious reasons, I didn't say anything about a monster. Instead, I told the cops that some crazy man was trying to break into my house. About 3 minutes later, the cops arrived. The police didn't see the monster when they reached my house. I played back the footage to show them what I saw, but to my dismay, the footage was nothing but static. The police searched my house and didn't find any intruders. It wasn't until after the police left that I realized something. That horrible smell was gone. Needless to say, I didn't get any sleep that night. About 24 hours later, the same thing happened. And just like last time, the video showed nothing but static. The police recommended that I stay with friends or family until the criminal was caught. I stayed with a friend who lived near the police station. Thankfully, the thing that terrorized me never came to my friend's house. A few days had passed, and the house got a visitor. It was Daryl. He asked my friend to speak with me alone. She agreed and offered the patio for us to have our conversation. "He came to you, didn't he?" Daryl asked. He explained that the thing I saw was an ancient spirit that haunted my house. Every year for a week, the entity terrorizes my home at night. Apparently, the previous owner had a quarrel with some practitioner of dark magic. The person then cursed the house, where the creature tormented him. This went on for years until the previous owner finally moved away. I don't know what happened to the person responsible for the curse. but they didn't remove it for some reason. By the time all this happened, I lived in that house for only 8 months. Plus, the real estate agent didn't tell me anything about the house's history. Daryl learned about the monster through his uncle who studied the occult. When I moved in, he taught Daryl to make a talisman that could ward off the creature. That talisman was the feathers left on my doorstep. Daryl apologized for not telling me everything. I forgave Daryl and even thanked him for helping me. After that, I got another talisman from Daryl. For the rest of the week, I left the feathers on my doorstep at night. I never saw the monster again. I don't think it was meant to hurt me. Based on what Daryl told me, it just wanted to scare me. In any case, I'm grateful that a neighbor had my back. Daryl, if you're hearing this, thank you. I've been a doctor for 10 years now. I'd seen people come to my hospital with all kinds of emergencies. Heart attacks, car accidents, pranks gone wrong, you name it. I'd seen so much gore that I was desensitized by it. By year 6, I thought I'd seen it all. But one patient proved me wrong. I still try to understand what happened to this day. The day started out as usual. At the time, my then 8-year-old niece was staying in my hospital. Her name was Jane, and she was admitted for appendicitis. I'd spend some time with her as much as I could. That morning, I comforted Jane before she was taken to the OR. She was understandably scared about the surgery. Thankfully, Jane calmed down just in time. My niece was taken to the OR, and I returned to work in high spirits. But my peace of mind didn't last long. About 5 minutes passed, and I witnessed a chaotic scene. I saw a man being rushed into the emergency room. From where I stood, I saw that he was missing an arm. I'd seen people come into the hospital with missing body parts. What made the situation odd was that the man wasn't reacting to his injury. No, the man wasn't unconscious. He was wide awake, but didn't move or make a sound. I concluded that he was weak from blood loss. As the wound was being cared for, I was briefed on what happened. The man was lying face down in a backyard with his arm cut off. A neighbor saw him when he was mowing his lawn. Apart from the lost limb, there was one other problem. The man didn't have any ID on him. The paramedics also suspected that he broke into the property. So just to be sure, the hospital called the police. The plan was to determine who the patient was and if the house was actually his. Meanwhile, I had to take care of our possible intruder. I was making my way to the patient's room when I ran into Dr. Blake. He was one of the doctors who tended to the patient's wound. I greeted Dr. Blake when I noticed a horrified look on his face. My initial thought was that he had lost the patient. When I asked what happened, Dr. Blake's response shocked me. He said that the patient didn't have any blood. My colleague explained that while the patient was being treated, the doctors noticed that the wound wasn't bleeding. But the most shocking thing was revealed by the EMTs who retrieved the man. When they checked his blood pressure, they couldn't get any readings. I suggested that the EMT's device was likely broken. However, Dr. Blake claimed that he couldn't determine the patient's blood pressure either. It's as if he didn't have any blood at all, yet for some reason, his other vitals were normal. I entered the patient's room to check on him. He was lying in bed with a blank expression on his face. His eyes met mine when I approached him. I asked the patient how he was feeling. No response. I figured that the man was either deaf or mute. I always carry a pen and notepad around if I need to remember something. I took them out of my pocket and handed them to the patient. He jotted something down before handing the notepad back to me. All he wrote was, "I need to get home." I viewed this as the perfect segue to ask the patient where he lived. When I did, he wrote down the address of the house he came from. But when I asked more questions, he wouldn't answer. Soon, the police arrived at the hospital. 2 detectives asked to speak with the patient alone. I wasn't around when the next part of this story happened, so I can only tell you what I've heard from my colleagues. After being questioned, the patient was discharged soon after. Apart from the missing arm, he seemed perfectly fine. I also learned that the house the patient was found at was really his. Apparently, some lunatic tried to rob his house. He carried a machete in case someone was home. I'm sure you can guess what happened next. The burglar escaped by the time help arrived. By my next shift, I'd forgotten about the weird incident. That was until I visited my niece. We were chatting when she told me that she'd seen Mr. Vital in the hospital. Confused, I asked who Mr. Vital was. The description and address she gave me matched the strange man from the day before. I didn't mention this before, but my niece and that patient lived on the same street. When I asked her why she called him Mr. Vital, I regretted it immediately. It turned out that Mr. Vital had the ability to be severely injured and not die. Not only did he have no blood, but he could also heal from any wound. If I didn't see this Mr. Vital character myself, I never would have believed it. I asked my niece what was keeping Mr. Vital alive. Neither she nor anyone had a clue. Jane told me that Mr. Vital was harmless and usually kept to himself. After hearing all of this, I finally understood why Mr. Vital was discharged so soon. Fast forward a couple of weeks and I'm visiting my sister, Jane's mom. I just entered her street when I saw a familiar face. Mr. Vital was walking down the sidewalk. When I pulled over to get a better look at him, I saw his wound. There was a nub about the length of a bicep where his wound should be. I don't know what Mr. Vital is or how he could regenerate a whole arm, and I don't think I'll ever stop until I figure it out. I moved into my house about a decade ago. I used to live on the opposite side of town. I won't bore you with the details of why I moved and all that. Instead, I will skip to when I first set foot in my house. It was an open house day, and I was the only person there. I guess nobody else was looking for a new home at the time. Anyway, I was checking out the kitchen when I found something unusual. There was a digital clock on one of the walls, but as I observed it, I realized that it was a timer. When I asked the real estate agent about it, he said that he had no idea what it was for. The house was built in 2001. The people responsible for its construction never explained the timer's purpose. Everyone who's lived in the house claimed that nothing happens when the timer hits 0. The timer then resets itself at a time different from the previous one. For example, one of the former homeowners was in the kitchen when she saw the timer set itself for 7 hours. 7 hours later, the timer blinked a few times before resetting itself to 90 minutes. Since the timer hasn't caused any problems, everyone just ignored it. I liked the house and the price was great, so I bought it. I was unpacking my stuff in the new home when I felt something brush by me. I looked around but saw nothing. I assumed it was a draft until I realized that all the windows were closed. That night, I went to the kitchen to grab a beer when I noticed the timer. It had just reached 0, and I'd felt like something had moved past me again. But like the last time, I didn't see anything. It took a few more episodes for me to realize the pattern. If I'm in the house when the timer reaches 0, the weird sensation occurs until the timer resets. I'll admit that it did scare me a little at first, but over time, I learned to ignore it. About 4 months passed, and my friend Rodney decided to come over with his cousin, Ro. For context, Rodney's dad moved from South Korea to the US 20 years before he was born. Ro was a shaman from a small village in South Korea. When Ro entered my house, she stopped at the doorway and looked around. Both Rodney and I looked at her confused. When asked what was wrong, Rose said something that was more baffling. "This is a Crossroad House," Rose said. She explained that Crossroad Houses provide spirits with passageways to different worlds. These houses were originally meant to help spirits of the dead cross over. However, other spirits started using these portals too. Some were even demons. Just as Rose said that, every light bulb in the house suddenly burned out. When the place was dark, strange beings emerged from the walls before disappearing somewhere else. These things varied in forms, such as orbs and apparitions. It reminded me of the graveyard scene from the Haunted Mansion. I froze as one demon passed by me, staring me down before disappearing through a wall. This lasted for a few seconds before every spirit vanished from my house. I stood there trying to process what had just happened. I then noticed a faint green glow from the kitchen, the same color as the numbers on the timer. I checked the clock on my phone and saw that it was 5:23 p.m. I then recalled what the timer showed that morning. It was 7:40 a.m., and the timer was at 9 hours and 42 minutes. I did the math and realized that the time ended a minute ago. I then made my way to the kitchen and checked the timer. Sure enough, it had reset itself. After putting 2 and 2 together, I finally understood the timer's purpose. I returned to the living room and explained everything to Rodney and Ro. I didn't understand why the spirits made their presence known like that. Not to mention that they've never made themselves visible before. According to Ro, the scene that unfolded was due to the high traffic. There was so much collective energy that it affected the electricity in the house, and of course, made the spirits visible. After that, Ro taught me how to protect myself from dangerous spirits. Just carry around a blessed amulet and do a Korean chant every morning. I still live in the Crossroad House. To this day, the only people who know the truth are me, Rodney, and Ro. No one else would believe us anyway. My house hasn't experienced another high traffic episode yet. Not while I'm at home anyway. I'm used to living in my Crossroad House now. I'm willing to spend the rest of my life here, so long as the amulet and chant keep me safe. I've lived on Bell Parkway my whole childhood. Growing up, I've never seen or heard of anything bad happening here. There was this one time someone hit a tree while riding his bike. But apart from that, everything was bliss. Don't worry, the guy was okay. A neighbor told me that he was staring at his crush when it happened. But one day, I discovered a disturbing truth about my street. At the end of Bell Parkway, there's a house that's always vacant. I used to think that it was because it's too expensive or something. That was until something happened that eventually led me to the truth. It all started when my friend Darwin moved back into his parents' house. They passed away in a car accident and they left the place to him. By then, I was living somewhere else. When I heard what happened, I drove to his old home and gave my condolences. We started with typical small talk, but then Darwin said something confusing. He said something about a smoky smell that came from his room. I'd visited Darwin's house lots of times since we were children, yet I couldn't recall a single time when I smelled smoke. Darwin explained that the smell only occurred at night. He had no idea where the smell was coming from. What was more strange was that his parents never noticed it. From what Darwin could tell, the source was coming from outside his house. He has a habit of sleeping with the window open during warmer nights. Darwin concluded that his parents didn't smell anything because they slept with their door and window closed. I asked Darwin if he saw something outside, like a fire. Darwin swore that he never saw any fire or smoke. Anyway, It's been years since Darwin moved away from his parents. Whatever caused the stench back then had to be gone by then. I got a call from Darwin the next day. He decided to sleep in his old room during his first night in his parents' house. He wanted to be sure that the nightly smoke smell was gone, but to his dismay, it wasn't. He was about to close the window when something caught his eye. There was a faint glow coming from one of the windows of a neighboring house. That house was the empty one at the end of the street. Darwin thought it was a small fire. He called the fire department and told them there was smoke coming from next door. When the firefighters arrived, they couldn't find anything. They only noticed a lingering smell of smoke. The firefighters believed that a group of people broke into the house to smoke. As lame as the theory was, no one had a better explanation. After that, Darwin decided to take matters into his own hands. Darwin asked me to investigate the house with him the following night. A normal person would have refused. I, on the other hand, was willing to do so. In all honesty, I too wanted to know what was causing the smoke. That evening, I met Darwin at his house. The plan was to break into the house once we smelled the smoke. If someone was responsible, we'd call the police. Darwin kept a handgun in his room for protection. I keep pepper spray on me at all times. Once the smell returned, we made our move. We entered through a window in the back of the house. The stench got relatively strong as soon as the window opened. Darwin and I followed the smell to a room on the second floor. We soon realized that it was the room Darwin saw the glow in. The smell was definitely the strongest in that room. As Darwin and I looked around, I noticed a slight glow coming from the closet. I tapped Darwin's arm and then pointed at the closet. We both stood in front of the door, preparing for a confrontation. I grabbed the doorknob and turned it slowly. I then opened the door quickly, holding up my pepper spray. What Darwin and I found would haunt us forever. The entire inside of the closet was on fire. Standing in the center of the chaos was a woman in a tattered dress. Her skin was charred with most of her hair missing. Her dress was torn up and a foot was missing a slipper. The female reached out to me as she shuffled in my direction. I slammed the door shut and Darwin and I fled the house. We retreated back into Darwin's place, scared to death. Neither of us slept a wink that night. When I drove back home the following morning, I decided to do some digging. All my life, I never cared about the vacant house's history. But after what I'd witnessed, I decided to finally do some research. I googled the address and found a news article. The headline read, "Tragedy on Bell Parkway." Here's the story of the house based on what I've read. About 30 years before I was born, a couple named Kent and Margaret lived in the house. Kent was on a business trip when something terrible happened. In the middle of the night, the house caught on fire. Margaret was found in the master bedroom closet, burned to a crisp. The police determined that she was in the closet when someone threw a Molotov cocktail at her. Unfortunately, they never caught the guy responsible. Kent moved away after that, and the place had been vacant since. I emailed the article to Darwin immediately after reading it. We figured that the fire department didn't see Margaret's ghost because she disappeared before they got there. I then realized the reason for the house's vacancy. It's because nobody wants a home with a dark past. I also suspect that some potential buyers were worried about having to see Margaret. I can't say for sure if that's true or not. In any case, I hope the house gets demolished soon.